Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Suk, the fundraising lead for Right on Con. I'm very excited to be chatting with children's and YA author Alexander Diaz about shiny new ideas. Alex, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you doing, Sarah?
I'm great, thanks. For those of you who don't know, Alex is the author of The Only Road, Good Girls Don't Lie, and When We Were. Alex, can you tell us a bit about your books?
Sure, definitely. So, The Only Road is probably the one people have heard of the most. It's a modern day immigration novel.
Mm.
It's about two children from Guatemala who, because of a massive gang violence happening in their village, they are forced to leave their home in Guatemala and undertake the treacherous journey of traveling through Mexico to attempt to immigrate into the United States. I won't say whether they make it or not because I don't want to ruin it for you.
Mhm.
The two books are young adult. So sorry, The Only Road is for middle grade. So the other two are young adults. Good Girls Don't Lie is a teen pregnancy novel.
Oh.
So a lot of controversial issues there as well. And When We Were is has had a very interesting past. It was originally titled "Of All the Stupid Things." An ebook publisher retitled it to "When We Were," but
Mm.
now that ebook publisher has gone out of print, so it's currently untitled.
Oh, okay, in
But
limbo
that,
somewhere.
yeah, yeah. And that was a novel about three friends and what happens to their friendship when a new girl enters the picture.
Oh, very interesting. So you've written quite a few different stories, it sounds like.
Hmm.
So on the topic of shiny new ideas, how do you choose which idea to write and which to put on the back burner?
Well, that's always a challenging question. Um, and as a writer, I have at least five different ideas that
Mm.
are continuously in my head. And I would say I go with the one that is jumping up and down and nagging me the most. So it's the one that I think about when I'm walking the dogs, when I'm
Mm.
cooking, when that I just cannot get out of my head. And sometimes I will even see my characters walking down the streets and be like, "Oh, that's my character." Or I'll see a situation and I'll be putting it in thinking, "Oh, I need to remember this
Mm.
for my character." So, yeah, it's definitely the one that feels most passionate at the moment, and it may change, but I think people's guts and people's instincts are really the best indicators to say what would be a good thing to focus on because that's where your
Mm.
heart is.
Mm. Mhm. Do you keep a list of all your ideas? Like, do you record them down somewhere, keep it on your phone?
I do not keep a list per se. I have a notebook that I've had for several years, and it really is just an idea notebook.
Mm.
So anytime and it may just be something somebody has said or a situation, then I'll jot it down and it'll be kind of a for further use later at some point, maybe perhaps. But it's not an actual list of, oh, I have this, and this idea.
Mm.
I'm not that organized, I guess, is the bottom line.
Um, so when you say you have like all these different ideas and like you see your character walking down the street or like you're like, oh my gosh, that's totally my book. How can you tell if an idea is enough to fill a whole book or if it's just enough for a short story or even just an interesting an idea?
I don't think you can really know until you dive in and start working on it. Because there's been many times that I have started writing something just based on a small idea, thinking, "Oh, well, this is going to be a short story, or this, can be a collection of something else." But then when I actually sit down and write on it, then different ideas start developing, and sometimes even the initial idea is no longer a factor in
Mm.
what I end up writing, but
Mm.
it was the springboard that led me on to something else and potentially led me on to something much bigger than I had initially thought of. So
Mm.
I definitely if for people who are requesting advice, I definitely would say give each idea a go and write a chapter or 2, and if it feels like it's not gonna go anywhere, then you've only invested, the time it took you to write a couple chapters. But
Mhm.
usually, once you get into the idea, then a lot of other things will spring up and come from it. And I mean, there's also the chance that, an idea might not be right for the moment, but it might
Mhm.
be suitable for something else. Or maybe it's suitable for a character, a secondary character. So you can add that to your future writing as well and not necessarily forget about it altogether.
Right. When you say that sometimes your ideas act as springboards to other ideas, has that
Yes.
ever happened to you? Does it happen often?
Um, it does happen to me, and I would say it happens to me often. Um, I usually just have a very small concept of, oh, wouldn't it be cool if this happened? So, on a very, very basic
Mm.
idea. And then as I start thinking about my characters, it's like, okay, well, what kind of person would this happen to? What kind of situation would he or she need to find herself or themselves to be able to, make this work. And
Mhm.
then as I start brainstorming it that way, then yes, it does evolve. It's like, okay, well, it actually sounds kind of cliche to have this idea, but on the other hand, it has opened up all of these other possibilities. So yeah,
Mm.
it does happen often, and I think part of that has to do with allowing your stories to take form and to develop on their own.
Right.
And again, there's been many times that I have had ideas for my characters, and my characters, they have attitude. What can I say? They're my characters. They'll be like, "I'm not going to do that. Who do you think I am?" Like, really? And then they're like, "No, I'm going to go off and live in a tent." And it's like, "Okay, I hadn't thought you would do that, but hey, I can see where that would be appropriate
Ah,
for you."
interesting. Huh. When you have a brand new shiny idea, do you find that it's usually for yourself personally a plot idea or a character idea? Like, do you start with like, oh, this would be a really interesting that would happen, or is it more of this would be a really interesting character to write about?
I think it's a little bit of both. So it's definitely like, oh, it would be interesting to have um a girl who is questioning her sexuality, for instance.
Hmm.
So, right there you have a plot and you have a character right
Right.
there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's how it often works with me, that I
Mm.
have a character in a situation. So it's simultaneously a theme, a plot, and an individual.
Right. So it kind of all comes hand in hand.
I think so. I think so. I mean, there's definitely authors who are more character driven and others who are more plot driven. Um, I would like to think I am equally both, but
Uh-huh.
I think it's hard for somebody to be self objective like that. But
Right.
yeah, in my mind, they seem to go hand in hand.
Mhm. Do you find that a lot of your ideas kind of come spontaneously? Like you see something and you're like, oh, that's interesting. Or it just like as you're doing the dishes, a thought comes to mind? Or is it something you sit down at your desk and you have to craft it out and kind of think of what an idea could be?
Um, there's definitely some spontaneous ideas and often reflected by something I see, a conversation I overhear. But at the same time, if somebody tells me, tell me a story about, you know, a, a little man, and I'll be like, okay. And then, I can kind of think of an idea like that.
Mm,
I mean, that was just an example. Like, I used to do a lot of babysitting, and
mm.
the kids I would take care of would often say, "Hey, tell us the story about, something."
Oh. Hmm.
Um, and then yeah, so I can work both ways. can be spontaneous, but also if somebody gives me a spark, then I can take that and run with it.
Oh, that's great. Do you
I don't.
find do you find that there are advantages to one method over the other, or
No, because I think every person is different and their creativity and the way that their brains work is very different.
Mhm,
So it's the same as saying that you always have to do something, and that's not the truth.
mhm,
Because some people are very visual learners, for instance. Some people are more audio learners. So you
mhm,
can't really tell somebody who is learning or developing in a very visual way, oh no, you can only listen to this. That wouldn't work.
mm,
So I think the everyone needs to kind of find what works best for them. I
right.
have some friends who will outline their stories like chapter 1, this is what happens, chapter 2, this is what happens. And for them, that's a structure that really works. For me, that's not work. That's
Mhm,
not something that helps me. But yeah, it's finding what works and how you can best develop your own creativity when you
mm,
are writing.
mhm. It's a very personal process.
I think so, definitely. And some people write very linearly, like beginning, middle, end. Other people start somewhere in the middle and then they put in a flashback, and
Mhm.
then they the next thing they write is a description on a love interest. And then once they have all the pieces, then they kind of like mix them up and put them together, and it makes a story. So, yeah, there's definitely not one way to do it, and you just have to go with what feels right. And I think a big thing of writer's block is that people seem to think that they have to go from A to B
Mm,
to C in that kind of order and not allow themselves to be creative. And all right, if you want to write the end. Sometimes people never write the beginning of their story until they have written the end.
mm,
So there's not really any right or wrong way, just finding what works for you.
mhm.
If you don't know what's gonna happen next, skip it. Find something that you do know what's gonna happen.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. Um, so when it comes to choosing an idea and sticking with it, so sometimes writers may choose a new shiny idea, but then get into the project and have second thoughts. How do you differentiate between having chosen the wrong idea and just going through the usual writer's insecurity?
I think it comes down to whether you feel connected with your character and
Mm,
your situation.
mm,
So, if your character is coming across kind of, reluctant and depressing, maybe that is what your character needs to go through, but maybe it's also just a way of saying, hey, maybe it's not the right time to write this character. Um, every writer is going to feel insecure. I mean, that's just a given. But I think it does come down to what I mentioned earlier about what you're feeling in your heart. So
mm,
if you truly believe in your character and in the story, then even if you get to points and are like, oh, I'm not really sure about this part. Yeah, if you are truly passionate about it, you're finding yourself thinking about it when you're cooking, when you're walking the dogs,
mm, mhm,
in traffic, whatever. Then that is an idea that is worth sticking with.
mm,
Um, there are, of course, people who find it very difficult to finish anything because they get bored.
right.
So for a person like that, I would say set yourself with small goals.
Mm,
So if writing a novel, it never gets finished because halfway through you're like, I'm bored with these people, I don't really care what happens to them. Then maybe focusing on a smaller story where
mm,
you know where it's going to end, so you have something to work towards.
mhm, mm. Is there such thing as a shiny old idea? Maybe something that you've already tried before, but ultimately had to shelf? And if so, how do you go about approaching old ideas that you've already tried but still stick with you?
I would love to think that there are shiny no old ideas. There are definitely, um, some stories that I wrote as a teenager that still stick with me, and I still make notes with them. There are, stories that I started writing and then got to the middle bit and like, I don't know what's gonna happen next, I'll shelf it.
Mm.
But they stay with me. So I think as long as ideas stay with you and you are actively thinking about them, it is definitely worth revisiting, going back
Mm.
to them. And there's nothing wrong with rewriting something that is old. I think the problem that a lot of people might face is they've written something 20, 30 years ago and they expect that it is, absolutely perfect, even though they haven't done anything with it in
Mm.
those 20, 30 years. So, yeah, the idea I think will still remain good, but it will need some revamping. It will
Mm.
need modern modernization. And ultimately, you are a better writer the more you write. So something that you may have written as a teenager may not be the best prose in the world, uh,
Sure.
but the idea behind it was still good. So
Mm.
I have yet to have a shiny old idea become a published work, but I do have hopes for it because, yes, they definitely stay with me, and um, I'll find myself like, hey, I want to rework this, and
Mhm.
um, I'll start again, and different things will keep me from ever completing it
Mhm.
to
Mhm.
what I think it can become, and it's usually because something else comes along. It's like, okay, well, this one I know has a home, so I need to work on that.
Right, fair enough, yeah. Um, should the market ever play a role in which idea you choose to pursue?
I think so, to some extent. You have to understand that the market changes, and also it is, um, it takes a long time, first of all, to write a book, and second, um, to get it published, get it accepted for publication, and actually have it as a finished book. So
Mm.
even if you have something that is finished now and gets accepted now, it's still going to be about a year and a half before it actually sees the day.
Right.
So, I mean, that was something that happened a lot with people who, when Twilight became very big, then suddenly everyone thought, "Oh, I should write about vampires because vampires is a popular thing and everyone wants to read more about vampires." But by the time, they finish their vampire story, find somebody to buy it, and it could potentially be, published, people are like, "No, we're so tired of vampires, we don't want them anymore."
Right.
Right. But on the other hand, I think there are a lot of things that are happening, um, I would say more globally, more news-wise, and that is something that you can pay attention to. So things that will ring as true today as they will in a couple years. For example, immigration issues. There's always going to be immigration issues. There's
Mhm.
always going to be, um, a need for more diverse books, for instance.
Mhm.
Um, right now in the media, you're hearing a lot about, women's roles and women who have been, sexually assaulted. So I think, that would be, a good topic to pursue as well. It's something that's in the media, and even if there's something completely different that's happening in a couple years, it's still relevant, it's still topical, and it's something that can resonate with a lot of people. So it's not
Mhm.
just going with the fashion of, oh, everyone has vampire stories, and I'm going to become famous if I write myself a vampire story.
Uh-huh.
um, and I mean, there are people who try to be like ahead of the trends, and I think that's so difficult because you can never know. I mean, okay, it was vampires, and then I remember people saying, "Well, it's obviously going to be zombies next,"
Mhm.
and zombies kind of took a little bit of a rise, but at the same time, they weren't like the big thing.
Right. Would you say that your idea choosing process changed after you became agented or published than before you had an agent or were published? How much does that affect your idea choosing process?
It does play a factor to it because if your agent is not interested in your story, then and it's sad, but it is true, then you kind of lean towards ideas that you know your agent will be able will first of all be interested in, and second, theoretically be able to sell. So
Hmm.
yes, it does contribute, but at the same time, I don't think it should stop you from writing what you are passionate about.
Hmm.
So, just to throw it out there, if you really like dogs and your agent's like, yeah, we don't really need another dog story. Can you write something about a gecko instead? About it, and he's like, yeah, actually, I could write about geckos. They're totally cool animals, but I don't think that should mean that you should give up on writing on dogs.
Hmm.
Um, but know that your agent may not be their dog story, and I'm
Right.
just throwing that out there as an example. But yeah, it does. It's you if you want to be a professional in your field, you want to give the public what they want.
Right.
So, or what they and in this case, give your agent things that she sometimes he most agents are she's are excited about and enthusiastic,
Mm.
because even if your agent um is willing to sell it, but they're not really into the story, they're not going to put the same effort to try to get it sold than if it's a story that really sings to them.
Right. Right.
So yeah.
Do you ever have like brainstorm collaborations with your agent or editor?
I have in the past, and usually it comes along the lines of, I've been hearing people really want a story about this. Are you able to write that kind of story? So
Hmm.
it's really more generic
I see.
than, oh yeah, well, write about this thing and then have this happen. So it really is pretty broad.
Mm.
The brainstorming sessions that I've had. Other people don't have different relationships with
Right.
their agents or editors.
Mm-hmm. Once you're published, how important is it for you to stay on brand? So to write stories in a similar genre or following a similar theme?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer that. Because my three books have been published by three different publishers, and
Okay.
they're all very different.
Mm.
So, yes, I think if you have found a niche for yourself, it's really good to stay with it. But at the same time, yes, it can be very frustrated to be branded as, um, a certain kind of author that only writes certain kinds of books.
Mhm.
You will find that quite a lot of people do have very diverse books. They are often, though, with different publishers. So, with one publisher, you might be known as the romance novel. And
Mm.
then with another publisher, you might be known more as the, you know, picture book about animals
Oh,
uh,
interesting.
kind of writer.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, and publishers do like you to kind of certainly stick with your genre, even if you change your themes a little bit, because then they know how to market it and they already know how to present you
Mhm.
to their distributors. Um, so, for instance, I write middle grade for Simon and Schuster, and you know, they haven't exactly said they don't want YA, but they have sort of made it imply, no, that idea was a little too YA. We want you to stick to middle grade,
Oh,
uh,
interesting. Okay.
which is totally fine. That's what they want. That's what they feel they can market, and
Mhm.
that's where they feel, my readers are leaning towards. So
Right.
you know it. But that said, they also said, if I ever have a picture book idea, so you can't you can't really
Right.
say that. And yeah, I'm certainly somebody who does not like to be pigeonholed and
Mm.
only assume that I can write one kind of book. So
Mhm.
um yeah, they get a little boring after a while.
Mm.
I'm sure you've read books by certain people that's like, oh, is it another one? It's the same plot over and over and over again.
Mm, mhm. Yeah, that's interesting about, like, the different publishing houses. I've never thought about that before.
Yeah, and I would say most authors have worked with different publishers.
Mhm.
There are a few who have one publisher, and they have a great relationship with that publisher, and that publisher is willing to pretty much publish whatever they want in whatever age spectrum. But yeah, I have found that certain publishers like to keep you in a certain genre.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. What advice would you have for someone who feels like they've just run out of shiny new ideas for a long time? They feel pretty dry in the brainstorm category. How do you spark your imagination again?
I would see if you can get together with a group of people
Mm.
and think about the things that interest you. So, if you're passionate about um, dogs, if you're passionate um, about uh, vampires, whatever, and then yeah, see with that group of people, what kind of new idea can you spark up, and sometimes having just other people's inputs
Mm,
could really help stimulate your juices. And sometimes all it takes is one person to say, what I really want to see is a story about a vampire who who loves the daylight. Just I'm just throwing that off the top of my head, and that might be enough to spark a new idea. It's like, yeah, I never thought about that. I can work with it. Let's see, what would make that possible.
mm,
Sometimes also just getting out of your head. So if you're thinking about something, you tend to be in a horrible loop where you don't necessarily get anywhere.
right.
But if you
Yeah.
write down, like physically write down, I do not know what to write about. Should I write about this doorknob that looks funny? And just like allow yourself the time to write a like complete rubbish,
Uh huh.
complete garbage, and give yourself that opportunity to just let whatever is in your mind out. And I think that is really, really helpful because suddenly putting it into paper can spark new ideas and can say, hey, I never thought of it this way.
Mhm.
um, which is weird because obviously you have to think in order to write, but your brain does seem to get um, a little less detached, and it just allows words to flow if you have that opportunity to just give yourself a free write. And you could even time it and say, right, for the next 5 minutes, for the next 10 minutes, I am not going to put the pen down. I'm going to keep writing. And it doesn't matter
Mhm.
if it turns out into, purple pineapples, love the scenery, leaves blowing in the breeze.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
Because there just might be a good story in there, and that might just be what your brain needs to let go and not over process thing and overthink things.
That's great advice. Well, finally, Alex, if any of our listeners or your readers want to find you online, where can they connect with you?
I have a website. It's alexandra-diaz.com. Don't need to spell out the hyphen. And my email address is listed on that website, so anyone is welcome to contact me. I am also on Facebook under Alexandra Diaz Author, and on Twitter, Alexandra T. Diaz. If you break it down, it looks like Alex and Rat Diaz. Wasn't intentional, that's just the way it works.
Oh yeah, I love all those lowercase letters.
Exactly.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for the conversation today. It was very inspiring. Can't wait to think of all my new shiny ideas and possibly
Yay,
old shiny ideas after this conversation.
awesome.
Well, thank you so much for all you listeners as well for tuning in. And yeah, have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, bye.
Bye.